It's official. I can finally say that I've had a chance to pour a couple more Black Mirror episodes into my eyeballs over the past week, and I've decided to talk about episode 2, Jonahs Awful. I think Jonahs Awful is just a hair shy of being my favorite, but Beyond the Sea has it by a nose. We're going in podcast style again, but I've got some visuals for those who prefer it. So let's dissect this story and go over the important scenes and events as we break down how it's constructed and presented to us. I'll do my best to call out any points of interest and notable details along the way. For the sake of keeping things straight and minimizing the confusion, I'm going to refer to the characters according to how they are perceived by the audience on the first viewing. If I'm confusing you already, don't worry, it'll make sense later. And I'll try my best to explain the crazy ending, but fair warning, it does get very complicated. This is a play-by-play, so there are spoilers galore. Make sure you're caught up before you watch, unless of course you're into that sort of thing. Shout out to the patrons for the love and support as always, and of course the Discord gang for keeping the fire going. Feel free to check out the links in the description should any of that interest you. Enough with the intro, let's get started. The story begins with our main character, Joan Tate, as she is waking up to her morning routine next to her fiance, Krish. Nothing unusual here, but I think it's good to note how the director makes sure we get a shot of the tube of Aquafresh toothpaste because it will be a callback reference for a later scene. Other than that, we basically watch Krish make breakfast for Joan, who seems not too interested. Already we're getting signals of something being off. Krish is presented as the ideal partner here, overall cool guy, so the writers are using him to help us see Joan's faults and issues. In these scenes, Joan is projecting the idea that her life is a little bit too humdrum and boring for her, even though on the surface, it looks like everything should be great. During the kitchen scene, things get interesting when we get our first real bit of intrigue that comes in the form of a phone call. Joan checks her phone and it looks like there's an ex reaching out to meet up with her on the low. Joan's body language says that she's excited by this development but trying to keep it wrapped, further confirming that this is someone she doesn't want Krish to know is texting her. Time to get to work. In the next scene, Joan is pulling out of her driveway. We get this view of a lively suburban neighborhood, suggesting that Joan is well-to-do, middle-class, suburbanite, and living the quote-unquote American dream. As she is about to leave, Mike, the friendly neighborhood jogger, happens to pass by with a pleasant greeting and boom, she's off to work. The message: Joan is known locally in the community. Everything we've seen so far will come back again with a decidedly different spin or flavor once the spicy stuff comes into play. When Joan's driving to work, she sings along to a Sweetie track called Tap In. Quick aside, this type of scene is used a lot in TV and film where you have a person vibing to music that doesn't seem to truly match up with the way they are presented. It's a funny way to relate to the audience that this character has a side to their personality that they usually keep locked down. Typically, it's one that wouldn't be acceptable in their social circles. It works well here because the actress, Annie Murphy, does a great job and she hits the marks perfectly. Next, we get an establishing shot of the workplace, a building that looks like your typical Bay Area tech company, and it's called Sonical, which rhymes with Oracle, and I don't think that means anything. In it, we meet Eric, who is what I assume to be her assistant. He asks her about the coffee and she says she's not pleased. This seems like a tiny detail, but it carries a lot of importance to Joan because it represents what she really wants, but for whatever reason, she's not pursuing. This comes up a few times throughout the story, but we really see the meaning of it in the end. Joan's first task of the day is to fire an employee named Sandy who is apparently working on a project that the company needs to complete in order to meet some sort of ethical compliance standard. But the big brass wants Sandy gone anyway, probably because money. Right before the actual firing, Joan gets another text from Loverboy as she's preparing herself for the unenviable task of letting an employee go. Next, we watch a shocked Sandy beg Joan not to fire her. She argues that it's not only bad for business because the project she is on is important, but also that she just signed a new lease on a place. To add more fuel to this trash fire situation, we learn that these two were previously on friendly terms because Joan had been invited to Sandy's housewarming. All of this is here to establish that Joan is put in a tight spot. She has to make the moral choice or do as she's told and keep her job, and she does what most people would do. She clearly doesn't want to go through with it, and we watch her squirm until her assistant bails her out by bringing the security guard over so that they can gather up Sandy and her things and escort her out. So Sandy gets canned and she's being escorted out of the building, but Joan is on a balcony platform thing above the exit. Joan is back on her phone again chatting with this mysterious ex-lover, but she manages to fumble an e-cig right over the railing and right onto Sandy's dome. Of course, this was an accident, but the timing couldn't be worse because it looked intentional. This ends up being one of the larger themes of Joan's story, being misunderstood and having her actions taken out of context. It's also an example of how a person's actions can easily be misunderstood without context or knowing their true intentions. Sandy has every reason to think this was intentional though, even though it was not. We see things like this in the real world, especially when it comes to social media and television all the time. Writers will take full advantage of this dynamic later on in the story, as we'll see. Joan pays a visit to her therapist in the next scene, which is always a good way to get some insight into what is going on with the character and get to the root of the conflict in their personal story. Note that this is the second time she has complained about bad coffee. During the session, she reluctantly admits to feeling like her life is stagnated and not up to her expectations. She sounds like she wants more excitement in her life, but she drags Krish pretty badly while she's trying to make this point, referring to him as vanilla or boring. Not a good sign for either of them, if I'm honest. One key line from Joan in this scene is when she says, "I feel like I am not the main character in my own story." Obviously, ominous foreshadowing of the future when considered post-viewing, but on the first watch, its other meaning is apparent. The main thing to take away from this scene is that Joan thinks her life is not enough, and she wants and believes she is missing out on the extraordinary life. Joan exits the scene and gets another text from her ex, Mac. This time, she replies that she wants to meet up, telling us that she is about to take action for better or worse. Joan meets up with the serial texter at a swank lounge, and the two do some light catching up while Mac does some heavy flirting. Note that we hear "Anyone Who Knows What Love Is" by Irma Thomas playing in the background. That's never good. This song made an appearance in both White Christmas and 15 Million Merits, and the results were disastrous for those characters. So Mac wants to get the band back together, and he proposes that they run off to San Jose and live in his cool apartment, and it's obvious that Joan is considering the idea for a moment, which should not surprise us after what she said back at the therapy session. But Joan hits the pause button because she feels uncomfortable and decides to leave, but Mac of course leaves the door open. She's got 3 days to decide. We could take this to mean that she either genuinely has love for Krish, or she's just uncomfortable making such a drastic decision on a whim, especially when it's to a known quantity like her ex, Mac. Okay, so this is when Black Mirror pedigree starts to show. Things begin to ramp up in the next scene as Joan returns home to Krish, who is making dinner. There's a funny moment where Krish gives her a taste of his cooking and she says something like, "Oh, that's interesting. What is that? Salt?" I thought that was pretty funny. This is more recall back to the therapy scene, a reminder that Joan thinks her relationship has gone stale. The couple then settle in to watch something on a streaming service that is an obvious parody of Netflix, and we see several Easter eggs and references to other Black Mirror episodes as possible options for viewing, but the one that sticks out is a suspiciously familiar looking show about a woman who looks a lot like Joan, so they decide to investigate. The show is called Jonahs Awful, and it doesn't take long for Joan to start feeling like something isn't quite right. They both begin to pick up on all of the similarities between the character in the show and Joan in real life. Eventually, it becomes obvious that the character on the screen is experiencing the same events as Joan's current day, but with many of the details either slightly altered or grossly exaggerated. By the way, that Aqua Fresh toothpaste from the beginning pops up again in the TV Joan's Wake Up montage to confirm that this is a legit reenactment. Joan is now convinced that somehow her life is being retold on TV by the global superstar Salma Hayek. Totally normal. As this is happening, the word about the show is spreading like wildfire as we watch Joan's coworkers and Mac discover the show on Streamberry. Clearly, even they believe the show is about Joan. It gets worse though. Joan begins to freak out when she realizes that her spot is about to get blown on national television. Her improprieties will be exposed to everyone she knows, including her family. She clownishly tries to stop Krish from seeing the show, but he's way too vested in knowing what the show has to say about her. Once Krish sees the TV version of what Joan says in her therapy session, and he finds out about her little rendezvous with Mac, well, he does the smart thing and packs his bags. I do wonder if he had heard the actual conversations as they really happened, would he have been as ready to walk away? Not so sure about that. Joan tries to convince him to stay, claiming that the show is misrepresenting things. When he asks her to prove it by showing him the actual text on the phone, she can't do it because she knows. And that is the last time we'll ever see Krish. A key thing here is the way that Salma Hayek's character's version of Joan, we'll call her TV Joan, is portrayed in a far more negative light than the reality of the situations they represent. The show does Joan dirty in every possible way. TV Joan fires TV Sandy. She's painted as a Cruella de Vil level ghoul, which we the audience know is not a fair depiction of Joan or what happened. This is more commentary on the sensational nature of modern media and how things are often exaggerated to make them more interesting and addictive, all in the service of getting the bag. Joan continues to watch her real life fall apart in real time and on TV, which has got to be the most surreal experience ever. The following morning, we see Joan getting ready for another day at the office on the heels of the nightmarish events of the previous day. The scenes show the audience how the world has changed for her, all because of a TV show based very, very loosely on her real life. The friendly neighborhood jogger isn't so friendly this time, which was hilarious. At the office, Eric informs Joan that the show has had a negative effect on her image at the company and that she's been kicked to the curb on a technicality. In the TV show, the character playing her revealed private company information, which boils down to her revealing private company information, sort of. Basically, her character is starting to influence her real life in a very negative way. So far, Joan has lost both the job and the boyfriend she complained about so much. Black Mirror is no stranger to irony. Joan is in a bad way at this point, and we get this from watching her obsess over the TV show while drowning her sorrows in booze. She's feeling pretty helpless here. She picks up a newspaper with a cover story about the producer of the show, lauding it as some great achievement in television because of the invention of the Quan Period. We don't need to know anything about quantum computers. Thank God, because that's an entire video on its own. We only need to understand that this is a plot device that produces amazing work, creating TV shows from nothing, but it draws its stories from the lives of real people. This is something we can relate to in reality. Joan heads to a law firm where a very patient lawyer fields her questions about her situation. She's looking for a way to kill the show, but the lawyer tells her in so many ways that she's thoroughly screwed and there's no legal means to stop Streamberry from using her private life and likeness because she signed off on it without being aware of it. Apparently, this deal was in a terms and conditions contract that she, of course, did not fully read but signed off on, because no one ever does, and the people who write these things are banking on that. The terms and conditions contract is thick, like cold oatmeal thick, yet within it there's a clause that signs a user's rights to their life and likeness away. That's pretty wild. The commentary is clear here though. The key point to take away from this scene comes from the lawyer when she explains that the TV Joan we've been watching is essentially a very advanced deepfake of the real actor licensed to Streamberry by the real Salma Hayek. Up until now, Joan was not fully aware of this part of the deal. We can see Joan begin to unravel as she realizes she's up against it. She's beginning to disconnect from her ego a bit, craps are not given, and she makes her frustrations known to everyone around her. In a way, this kind of reminds me of the Nosedive episode where we watch a character who lost everything, including their perceived social status. They get stuck in a desperate situation that begins to make them reassess their priorities. She's kind of experiencing a similar journey. A distraught Joan runs right into the arms of Mac for comfort, and he's more than happy to let her in. There's a funny scene where they are in bed together, but Mac has trouble with the 9-wood, forcing them to abort the mission because he's worried about how his character will be perceived on the TV show. He's not ready to be known as the guy who hit the ED wall in front of the whole world. Overall, this scene shows Joan's life continuing to be influenced by her TV counterpart in a negative way. It's invaded every part of her life and it's completely inescapable. Upset by the bedroom antics, Joan heads to Mac's living room to watch more awfulness. And this is where she has a revelation. She's got to take action and do something about this TV show on her own because the law is not going to help her. Unfortunately for Joan, her first big idea isn't her best, but it is sufficient. Joan has a eureka moment while watching the scene of her visit to the law firm. The lawyer mentions that the real Salma Hayek would have a lot of problems and would not be so comfortable with seeing her deepfake do certain things on TV. This is when a light bulb goes off. Joan was probably thinking something like, what if I do something that embarrasses TV Joan so much that she is forced to see me and deal with me, and then she'll want to stop the show? Probably. Sound logic, but I question her methods. Joan hatches a plan that involves tying her hair into pigtails while rocking a cheerleader outfit and putting a pic of a poorly drawn Johnson on her forehead. But wait, there's more. Joan loads up on several deluxe hamburgers and chases that with what looks like a bottle of laxatives and alcohol. The fuse has been lit. Joan rolls up to a church where a wedding is taking place and releases the payload right in the middle of the ceremony, to the disgust of a couple hundred poor souls. I lost it when they showed the kid crying in horror. So, do we call off the wedding at this point? I mean, it's already paid for, right? Just kidding. Anyway, gross perhaps, but it turns out this is a great way to get attention from the police. We never see TV Joan's version of this scene performed by the CGI Salma. It's only implied by the aftermath where the real Salma Hayek is talking to her lawyer to see if there's a way to put the kibosh on these humiliating scenes or get out of the contract in some way. But just like Joan, she's also in a legal bear trap, showing that even the rich and famous can fall victim to these predatory contracts. Side note, just so that we're keeping things straight, I will continue to refer to the Salma character that we see talking to the lawyer as real Salma, and her TV deepfake will be TV Joan. The first Joan we met, the main character that we've been talking about, is simply Joan. I'll update you when things get more complicated at the end. Both women are at the ends of their respective ropes, but it's real Salma who takes action this time. She decides to find Joan and pay her a visit to see if they can get this thing sorted. The meeting between the two is funny because Joan is shocked that real Salma actually showed up at her doorstep. Things start out a tad testy, but after airing out their grievances, both women recognize that Streamberry has them both over a barrel. Maybe they should work together. Legal solutions don't exist, so what's the next best option? Well, it's break into the Streamberry building and wreck the Quan Period, of course. This declaration marks the beginning of the final act of the story. Obviously, there are some obstacles to surmount. The Quan Period is housed in a building that is close to the CEO of the company, a Mona Javadi, so there is bound to be security to get past if they want to smash it to bits. So the girls put their heads together and devise a plan. Real Salma will use her celebrity clout to finesse her way past the security and let Joan in through a back door. Together they will locate the Quan Period, and it's clobbering time. Things go like clockwork at first, but they hit a snag when Joan and company run into Miss Javadi while she's in the middle of an interview. Here we get some passive exposition explaining what the Quan Period does, which is to take the likeness of a person and work them into a script based on their real life experiences. It does the entire job of creating a show in a virtual world to be consumed by real people. It's also the absolute laziest way to create a TV show. She explains that the show is intentionally focused on negativity because that's what people want. She even claims that they tried to make shows with a positive spin, but they didn't pan out, so they stick to salacious stories that are meant to foment rage and disgust because it gets views. All of this translates into turning outrage into cash. We know this song, we've heard it before, and it rings true. After eavesdropping on the interview, the girls finally locate the Quan Period, but they run into their first mini-boss. This guy is the server admin, and he's played by Michael Cera. This is one of the funniest scenes of the episode, and his part is hysterical. Beppe is here to explain the nuts and bolts of how the world works to the audience. I'm going to try to keep this simple, so here we go. So, Beppe reveals that Joan, the woman we've been following all of this time, is not a real person. She and her entire reality exist on a computer, just like the one we see in this world. So everything we've been watching is an adaptation created by a computer simulating the life of the real Joan, or Source Joan. So Source Joan is the real world Joan, and we've not met her yet. So again, Source Joan is the first Joan, and the Joan we are watching next to this Quan Period with the axe, she's a deep fake copy of a Source World level actress, Annie Murphy. This whole complicated relationship is repeated on several levels. TV Joan's world is a copy of the Source World. I hope that makes sense. It gets meta in more ways than one, but we really only need to keep the idea that our Joan is not the real Joan in mind. If you just remember this fact, then you're good as far as understanding what happens next and the final scenes. Beppe also explains that if they wreck the Quan Period, then the level above the one they exist in will be destroyed. As the computers are destroyed, each level will collapse down a level until there is nothing but source reality left. After Beppe has fulfilled his duties, he's knocked out cold, and it's glorious. And we see the security guys buzzing throughout the building because they realize real Salma is AWOL in the building somewhere. The pressure is on for Joan to decide the fate of this virtual world. She has to decide whether she will destroy the Quan Period and end everything, including herself. Joan realizes that if her life is a copy of what happens to Source Joan, then it must mean that Source Joan has already done everything she's done up until this point, as well as what she has in mind to do next, which is destroy the computer. She confidently begins to whack away at the machine each time reality changes a bit as the worlds begin to collapse back into the source level of reality. Finally, the server is kaput, and we're looking at the base level Source Joan, white streaks intact, as she's being hauled off to jail. She gives a nod of recognition to her partner in crime, who has collapsed back into being source level actress Annie Murphy, the actor whose likeness was the one we had been experiencing through most of the story. Yeah, I know, it's crazy. This episode does have a happy ending though, which I think is fitting given that it's still a comedy at the end of the day. In the final scene, we watch real Source Joan working in what looks like her very own coffee shop, and she looks happy. In walks a customer, the real Annie Murphy. The events of the story have apparently brought them together as real-life friends. An extra bit of info is that both women have ankle bracelets on, which can be seen as a symbol of how they're both captive to technology, but also their commonality despite being from very different walks of life. Ultimately, Joan learns that there is no such thing as an ordinary life, as long as you're happy with it. Also, be careful what you wish for, because sometimes life can get a little too interesting. That's it for this episode. I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, you already know what to do. If you're interested in seeing more of these, then let me know. Nautilus File signing off. Be good to yourself, be good to others, and I'll see you in the next one. Peace.